Morning, everyone. Welcome to webinar 2 of week 2 for the online museum training for today. No? So we welcome our participants again. So we have a very interesting topic for today. We are going to discuss museum design and architecture by our architect Aris. So just to give you a background that it is important to have also a good museum design considerations because the success of the museum also lies largely on the experience and the look of the museum. So museum architects are should be conscious of the way in which their designs forms the viewer's impression of the said institution. For the viewers, it is important to have this kind of first impression of the building, how the exhibits are arranged, and how the visitors can actually experience the order in viewing the exhibitions. So for the viewers, for the curators and all the people working behind the museum, it is important to have this very good museum experience and understanding of the narrative of the museum. And this largely depends on the museum design and architecture that allows the visitors to progress through the exhibits in a certain order. For instance, the basic function of your museum design and architecture is to direct the way in which the viewer experiences the exhibition. It also forms the impression of the museum as an institution. And lastly, to regulate the viewer's behavior while they are viewing the exhibition. So this morning, architect Aris will talk more of the detailed considerations in the design and architecture of the museum. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists this morning. Architect Aris received his bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of the Philippines in Diliman, and his master's in architecture from the University of Sydney's Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning. He is also the principal architect of 90 Design Studio, which is also based in Baguio. And this design studio is working in architecture, design, and urbanism. So they are also committed in creating innovative and unique projects. Design Studio was established in 2004. This is an architectural collective of architects, designers, and engineers based in Baguio that started with smaller projects such as residential renovations. Later on, they moved on to larger projects such as the redesigning of the Malcolm Square of the People's Park in 2015 and the G1 Lodge Hotel, which received the 27 Cooler Bowl Design Award for Urban Hotel category. They were also behind the design of the Creative Hub located in Malcolm Square, a centerpiece of the launch of Baguio City as a creative city in 2018. For UP Baguio, their team also designed the Teatro Amianan and Museo Kordilyera, for which they won the 2018 Metrobank Art and Design Excellence Award, or MADE, under the institutional category. So he continually derives his strength from his wife, Sue Ann, daughter Nina, and son Reese, and dreams of making a better city for them. Without further ado, we'd like to welcome architect Aris for his talk on museum architecture and design. Hello, Aris.
Hello.
All
Hello,
right.
Ikin.
So, good morning.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you, Ikin. I'll just share my screen.
All right. Thank you. And
thank you very much, Ikin, and to all of you who are here now. Hello. I would like to welcome you to this module on museum architecture and design. So I'll be running through several projects and several things we do this morning. So I'm very excited to start off with defining what a museum is. So the International Council of Museums defines museums as a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. So this may be the general definition of a museum, but it is really the architecture, how the spaces are determined, and how people individually experience the space, along with the curation, of course, that truly define a museum. It can be a place for confrontation and challenge, a place for contemplation, a place for study, or a place for rest, or simply an opportunity for dining, meeting up, or even shopping. So as we shall see, how we put together a museum can distinctively define it. In this module, we've selected some aspects of museums that is of interest to us. Then afterward, discuss the more particular and specific considerations that can be unique to a project. And I'll be ending with a few case study projects that we have done, including the Museo Kordilyera. The experience of artifacts is inseparable from the spatial experience of galleries where they are exhibited. This interaction of the building form and the exhibits give each museum and each of its galleries its own character. So this is a project we proposed for Circa in UP Los Baños last year. They were looking into adding a museum structure to their existing building, which was already in the initial stages of construction. And before proceeding with the extension of the building, they requested us to propose a design working with this narrow section of an existing parking lot. This section on the left. So this is located between a heavily planted creek from behind and a driveway in front. So it's a very narrow section. It's only around about 7.5 meters. So what we proposed to have various galleries in succession through this very narrow lot, while retaining most of the open space below. So creating a variety of spatial configurations like tall and narrow, so in a cube or a box configuration, a linear box, a grand exhibit space with triple height ceiling, an irregular box, interlocking spaces with a slight difference in elevation. So in combined boxes that with a loft that allows for visual continuity between the two spaces below and above. So by creating these varying interconnected spaces, we can minimize museum fatigue, described by a decrease in visitor interest toward exhibits. So it is important to consider space adjacencies and create a variation in light and spatial configurations between circulation and exhibit spaces. So because monotony sometimes would lead to, monotony may lead to optical efficiency, but it can lead to sometimes visual fatigue and emotional fatigue to the users themselves. So the variations of openings and exhibit spaces can not only create comfortable visual transitions for visitors and potential views of the outer environment, that can act as a point for relaxation for the eyes, but also elicit emotional responses as the spaces expand and contract. Another consideration that we think that is very important to a lot of projects, not only museums, but also all other buildings, is how people would access it. This is through by transportation. So here in the Philippines, a great majority of our transportation is done by, are met by cars, buses, trucks, and jeepneys, and probably a negligible amount via trains and mass transit systems, which are limited to just highly urbanized places like Metro Manila. So we've been extremely dependent on cars, and providing parking spaces has in most cases been high on the list of priorities because there are limited options at the moment. We'll have to change all of our the whole of our urban fabric to be able to solve this. But what do we do as of the moment? So nevertheless, we have to think about how these parking spaces could potentially be repurposed in the case that in the future, changes in transportation occur. Or if our parking spaces are flexible enough now, we could even utilize them as an extension for our exhibition spaces. Because the time cars use the use of cars in parking spaces is very limited. Um, the time they the time they the time they the time they use in parking space, we would rather have it like in at times we can reuse it for exhibition spaces. So we will just have to redesign these seemingly benign spaces to become more functional than just a waiting area for cars. So this is a building in Miami. So the Lincoln Road parking building exemplifies this well. The garage is fully open concrete structure. Ceiling heights vary between standard parking height, double or even triple height, like pictured here, in order to accommodate other programs permanently and temporarily. And there are retail units and private residents that are located on the upper levels, and the structures can also be used for parties, photo, film shoots, fashion shows, concerts, other social and commercial activities. So while offering all of these amazing views as a backdrop. So in going back to Circa, so in the case of Circa's museum, the management decided to have at the street level. So the management decided to have at the street level uh, to still have parking because this area they wanted to maintain the parking. So despite having other parking options elsewhere, but we decided to propose an alternative that would be better for the project and the people who will be using it, and have them take advantage of an otherwise dead space and by an otherwise dead space. So by leaving this space open and creating a public plaza where we can connect it with the creek behind the building here, we designed this connection by creating a amphitheater-like valley that functions as an activator space and allows people to rediscover this once neglected space. Our hope is that in this rediscovery, people would be made aware of the creek that is otherwise relegated to either being a storm drainage or a sewer line. This would not be possible or by simply accepting it as a parking lot or having it remain a parking lot. We won't be able to create this kind of connection. Now think about this in your own city or town or wherever you are. So most of our towns would have, creeks like this running in the middle, or bodies of water running in the middle of our cities, which we ignore, sometimes neglect or ignore, or it's sometimes they are even unseen. In the case of Manila, they're all underneath all of the concrete. So we could, what's good about this proposal for Circa is that directly behind it is the UPLB Theater, the Umali Hall. So you can just imagine the possibilities here. With this kind of connection, we could interconnect them, and we just created an outdoor theater. So we have a museum, then we have an outdoor theater, we have a creek between it, and then although of course the creek will need cleaning, well, it needs it anyway. So it rehabilitates and changes people's ideas or changes people's concepts of how we would use our creek. Instead of having fear, we embrace the creek, and we, instead of creating concrete walls, we create amphitheaters so that we can use it during non-storm circumstances. Another aspect that we need to consider when designing buildings, especially museums, is daylighting. Employing daylighting with its characteristic color rendering cannot be easily replaced by artificial means. Because of its continuous spectrum illumination from natural light, provides an unbiased color registration for all colors. Although there are variations in daylight throughout the day, the human eye can easily adapt to these changes and maintain accurate perception of the object's color, especially with daylight. Moreover, many of the exhibits, daylighting enables the visitor to observe them as close to the lighting conditions as those under which they were created. Especially in paintings, natural light can reveal more of the artist's palette and technique without altering the artwork's colors. So the use of daylight in museum galleries has been a challenge for us architects, mainly because of the risk of light damage from damage to the exhibits from ultraviolet light. So, however, by controlling the penetration of natural light, by redirecting, like in this picture here, or filtering it, putting UV filters in between, it can enhance the viewing experience of objects and contribute to the visual experience of the visitors. Another thing is to add sufficiently large workspaces and storage. So one of the museum's facilities has to be carefully considered are workspaces or workshops, and should be sufficiently large to accommodate the scale of exhibitions planned for the museum. So within these spaces, for collaboration and storage, this can be for collaboration storage. These spaces can be critical to the preparation of the exhibitions. They should allow for carpentry and storage of some tools, etc. And access to the outside is also critical from these spaces, and access to the museum. So a thoughtful layout would be ideal. Although another aspect would be the employees. Sometimes, although much effort in the design is focused on the visitor and the expected behavior, we should also take account the museum staff. Sometimes we forget the museum staff. So, and how the building can support them, because they're there practically 5 days or 7 days a week. Sometimes we leave the worst possible spaces for them. Although much effort in the design is focused on the visitor, we should also take into account the museum staff and how the building can support them. So providing sufficient connection to the outside, this is not possible in some cases, especially within exhibit areas, within break rooms, canteens, offices, these are necessary to provide connection to the outside and reduce disorientation and fatigue. So, which leads us to transparency. So, in the literal sense, from the experience of visiting a museum and seeing its galleries and collections, there is also the visual experience created from the exterior of the building. And this is not only for the visitors and employees of the museum, but the museum might become part of the everyday life of people around it. Museums as symbols of education should be open to society and be welcoming. So transparency is the key to openness, as it proposes a visual relationship between the interior and the exterior. The topology of side lighting openings is providing this relation with the environment and the surroundings, especially within urban areas. We can use the glass facades on the ground floor galleries that can overcome the borders of the interior space and make its exhibition part of the city's life. So this use of daylight openings can be perceived not just as a perforation of the container or the building, but as a break and diffusion of the interior to the exterior. So another thing to consider is, or to think about, is considering iconic buildings. Within the last decade, especially during the turn of this century, since 1997, since the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, there has been this class of museums whose civic role has been to become symbols or icons of cities and cultures, designated by their own architectural identity and as key to their value. So in most cases, architecture like this one are good. In other cases, sometimes the building itself is the artwork. So creating a place of mass attraction and attention. This has sparked a lot of debate among designers and architects with regards to the merits of creating that is something iconic. So thus a very careful consideration whether to go for something like this. It might not be for everyone. So within the bounds of context, should be considered very carefully. So we should also think about urban regeneration when we think about museums, because and museums should be thought of as engines of urban regeneration because they offer public spaces for people. In most of our towns and cities, public spaces have been reduced to mere display and sometimes none at all, replaced by large air-conditioned malls. So the museum of today should not just be an elitist bunker that stores artifacts and presents them to specific highly educated audience. It should be a public space where people can gather and meet. So, the museum should be a place that caters more to the public rather than an elite few. So the following are a review of some of the places that we've seen and some of the places that I think you should think about and put into your consideration. So one is the Sao Paulo Museum of Art. So the Sao Paulo Museum of Art was designed by Lina Bobardi in 1968, which was a long time ago. So she has approached this in a very novel way and was groundbreaking for her time. So Bobardi attempted to cater to the populist view that the museum and the site it stood on should belong to the people in the city. Not only would the museum return the same amount of public space that it borrowed, but it would embrace the radical notion that the museum could be both exhibit could both exhibit culture and at the same time serve as a stage on which it was created. By lifting the whole museum above the street level, the open space that is created turns into an extension of the city. So the space now is given back to the city as a public space for people to use. So this is a review of, the next one is the Mine Museum. So the Mine Museum, this is a review of it in a way. So the Mine Museum in Taguig are examples of museums that take advantage of by incorporating some public spaces into its design. Or as you see here, there is a large public space, covered public space, which is very ideal, especially with our climate. So this contributes to the design, at the same time embraces the relevance of the human scale and street connections. So when we first arrive in the place, um, these spaces are its major attractor. So that allow us to feel welcome. Uh, it's like this space creates the entrance to it that welcomes, like we're actually being invited into the building. So in addition, it encourages us to engage more with other users, which leads to us a human scale and the importance of street connections. So the mine, as you see here, the Mine Museum complex is, there are three spaces here. So it has this silent relevance to the site, where we have several public spaces aligned with the plaza. So we found this very interesting. So the plaza and the canopy of the Mine Museum is directly aligned to the two other spaces nearby. So the Bonifacio High Street and the Burgos Circle, creating an imaginary skewer, a walkable public space. So this alignment sort of encourages the continuation of Bonifacio High Street from here to the mine, through the Mine Museum to the Burgos Circle. Although these connections are not easily apparent and sometimes can be very weak in certain places like this crosswalk here. But this idea of connecting open spaces is a very good one, which we should also consider when we design our buildings. Because when we design museums, they are not, isolated islands. So we should always look for possibilities like this, especially to connect to the urban fabric. We are not creating a gem that's separate from the city. What we're creating is more of a rock that's part of the ground. So these pedestrian connections here and here need to be further strengthened. And because the possibility of creating this pedestrian loop that loops all around. So I don't know if this is part of their master plan. I'm sure it is, but there is a greater possibility to interconnect a pedestrian loop that runs all around the BGC, which is interesting. Although there is a plaza and a park on one side of the museum, which is ideal, there are some areas around the building which we found that misses the opportunity to engage with the public in a very meaningful way. Because they're covered, as you see here in this photo, they're covered with mostly blank walls and inaccessible podium and completely shaded windows. They have windows on one side. It's not pictured here, but um, the windows there are completely shaded. They could simply open it up and connect to the outside street. But if this is the configuration of the street, there's no connection. This becomes like a barrier to people, and this space just becomes a transit space instead of uh, making the space more livelier or enliven it. They could open up this space, create cafes, restaurants all around the building so that we can invite more people into the space and possibly enlivening the urban fabric of this area. So the transport, if you see here, because there are several lines of the lines in green are cars. So this makes the Mine Museum virtually an island. So, but by strengthening all of the pedestrian connections all around it, we can make this a better. We can increase the connections to the pedestrians all around it, and we can increase pedestrian traffic within this area. Possibly fully pedestrianize this area, much like what they did here in along High Street. Would be the best. Uh, the next one is the Ateneo Art Gallery. So Ateneo, this is Arete. It's the Ateneo's cultural hub. So it stands near the entrance along Katipunan, and the building that welcomes people. It's also the building that welcomes people. You'll be able to see it on the road, but you won't be able to directly enter it from the road. You'll have to go through some loops, as I'll show later. So these are, I think, aluminum slats, if I'm not mistaken. So they're cladded on the west side of the building. That reveals an odd transition to a box portion of the building. But the good thing about this one, they introduce a large plaza at the middle. So for gatherings, events with larger crowds. This is a rendering of it. So this is, I think, the symbolism here was this should be science, which is rigid and rigid, and the other side is art, where it literally converts the idea to the form of the building. So, but that you see here again, if you observe it, we observe that it's still disconnected with the street. We would prefer to have more connection because you have a large plaza here, and this should not just be your connection to the public. You should have most of the building on the outside so that they don't just become walls. You activate it, and by activating these areas, we create more spaces all around the building instead of just parking or just a sidewalk. So they have this varying several galleries in the art museum. You have varying heights. This is one with the lower height. This is the one with the higher heights. Although if you notice, they've named some of their galleries with their, I think, sponsors, which is okay, I guess. But yeah. So the galleries are well lit. There are no windows to connect the visitors to the outside. We would prefer to have sort of, in a way, even just slits of windows that connect the interior to the outside. It's also one way to orient people to the outside. So they have they have this space on the side of the building, which is, I think, a missed opportunity. They could create a more interesting connection or landscape that connects the buildings. But this could probably be still in planning. So this is the vehicular connection. So before you enter the building, you'll have to go through some loops. I think this is a security thing, but having users go through loops it's not a good thing for the building. So to reach the building, you must pass through a series of turns. This adds to the confusion, especially for those who seek the building. The building's clearance to the university parameters provide an inadequate amount of transportation level in comparison to its displacement. So this is the pedestrian circulation, which is better, but we think it can be strengthened even more because you have this large plaza at the middle, and this large plaza needs some sort of connection to a larger public. So creating a very strong pedestrian connection between these two buildings the buildings across it, it will further enhance the connection, the pedestrian, because it enhances the connection of the pedestrians. It also enhances the public space quality of the space of the building. And if you take a look at the parking space, they've located it here, where it's quieter. I think they should locate the building here instead of here. Parking would be here, and you have a row of trees that protects along Katipunan Road. But yeah, this is the decision. I think this is more strategic in my opinion, that they put the building on this side where the parking is instead of where it is now. Probably because they want the building, especially the arts building, to be seen on the outside. I don't know. So another building is the School of Design and Arts of Telesal Benil. So what's interesting about this is it was intended to stand out. The building was it's a standout from the neoclassical style of the LaSalle complex. So interiors of the building is filled with natural light. As a majority of the building is composed of a glass shell. Because of this, centralized air conditioning is required to keep the temperature of the building from getting too hot. This in return prevents the artworks and projects inside the building from deterioration and drastic temperature change. So the walls of most of the building, or if not all of the building in the interior, were intended to become the gallery itself for the students. So with the walls painted generally in white, some walls would provide blank canvases for different artists. Like they created the whole stairwell, they painted it with, because it's intentionally a blank canvas. The students are allowed to propose and create projects around these open spaces or white spaces. They also have places for galleries and exhibitions. And they also contain areas for temporary exhibitions and permanent exhibitions. So drywall panels can be easily installed on the walls and easily repaired. So for this is for several generations of students to use. So essentially, the whole space becomes a blank canvas. The next one is the Baguio Museum. So this was like establishes a design. If you look at the design silhouette of the building, it harkens to the Ifugao hut. So the design extends throughout the building, and the exhibitions inside, I think, is intentional. But what's intentional is the vernacular house, which the design is based on and mixed with sort of a Baroque-ish style, in a Baroque interior style, is probably the unintentional part. So the building exterior separates itself from the nearby places, and they have this wall that separates it from the public. And the entrance is on a podium, which is not too ideal. It may be unideal to prevent rats or insects from going up an Ifugao hut, but not into a building. And into a museum like this, we would prefer the entrance to be down, very much closer to the public. So the stylistic choices that have been made results in a very dim environment. If you take a look at here, they're using fluorescent light, which is very bad for the artifacts. So the massive walls maintain sometimes the massive walls and the floor feel very cold because the mix of the lighting, especially they are using very cold lighting, makes the space feel eerie at times. I would like also to point out the Bontoc Museum. So this is the Bontoc Museum. It's a sort of, again, inspired from the vernacular form. So we see the dangers of just simply borrowing the traditional forms and literally just translating it physically, so that we force the design to take on this kind of form. Sometimes because especially for museums, it will not work, as you will see here. But what we appreciate about the Bontoc Museum is that it it has this outdoor gallery where you have in a way, the real Bontoc houses in display, which I think they maintain, and they have this kamote patch, and they have live pigs in some areas. So you get a feel of the real thing in a way. Although these rocks, this is how not this is they just use like bare soil. Uh, this is not too authentic in a way. So including the houses, and then they have certain descriptors, and you even see at the back um, people hanging laundry. So yeah, but what's also interesting that they've not included into the exhibition are the contemporary, in a way, the more contemporary additions, which are like the American houses. This is right very close by, and I think they should add it as well into the exhibition to create some sort of timeline. And because sometimes we in the Cordillera are too obsessed with our native past that we forget that we have this continuity as well, the continuity of the culture. Again, another one is SLE Museum. I won't be saying a lot about it. It's other than it looks like a antique shop. So I'll be going through very quickly some of our proposals um, for the city and some projects that we did in the past. So, so since Baguio City has been declared a UNESCO Creative City in 2017, the city sort of required a creative hub of galleries, a museum, a workspace for the artists. So this place, um, the former Diplomat Hotel on Dominican Hill, which can be seen practically entire all around the city, or it used to be seen. Now it's covered in pine trees. You won't be able to see it uh, as easily as it was before. We used to see we used to see it when we were kids, but now because it's surrounded by pine trees, which is good. You won't be able to see it as clearly as before. So this is the interior of the retreat house. So existing spaces such as this space was quickly identified by the Creative Council. So the idea was to identify a place in the city where it becomes a collaborative hub for our artists and designers. So our proposal was to sort of uh, get the architectural form from the rocks that are nearby and put an extension on top while retaining the existing qualities that we like about the building. The plan was not to do much with the existing fabric and have it, the existing building, retain it as a ruin and reinforce it. Instead of reinforcing it with steel, we propose to reinforce it in timber as the structural support. So creating this um, uh, unusual contrast of material between the existing concrete and steel building with timber. And then clad the upper floor with corten steel or weathering steel. So we would have exhibition spaces, workshops, offices for creatives on top of the building. So the idea was to recreate some sort of community on top of the building, much like our traditional Cordilleran communities, where we have a very connected and very compressed space. Within a very compressed space, we establish our communities, and then use the new vernacular of using rusted steel. If you notice the houses of the here, especially here in the Cordillera, utilize a lot of GI sheet and a lot of steel on the exterior because of its lightweightness, and they're able to carry it very easily in very high slopes. So this is very ideal, and we did the same thing and clad the whole building with the same material that the new vernacular uses. So this is a rendering of the facade of the building. We also proposed a conceptual master plan for the Bagong Nayong Pilipino. So instead of having a in a way, it's an outdoor museum, more Disneylandish. Instead of having something like that, we would get from Filipino culture, not literally, not recreating sites which can be visited, but we would recreate Filipino landscapes, we'll recreate Filipino urban conditions, we um, uh, create a different Filipino landscapes. Yeah. So the location is in very near SM MOA or Mall of Asia. Mall of Asia is above here. And then it's very close to the sea. And our proposal, because of its very close to its proximity to the sea, is to raise it by a significant amount, raise the whole lot by a significant amount, and then we would be able to plant several forests, different types of forests on it, so that we have a fair distance between us and the highly saline water table here, because this is a reclaimed land. So that 4.5 meters allows us to plant a forest. And then, but before that, we will establish sort of, because the major transportation, as I discussed a while ago, of our country as of now are using cars. So we assume to have a large parking lot underneath, and then create a virtual estero, and then have the buildings, instead of on the ground, just as we had before, have them raised to a certain level, and then have that shaded, so that we have a whole park that is both, uh, we have a park, a forest, and a shade where people can use, especially during midday, because parks are essentially unusable during midday or during the middle times of the day. So this is our whole master plan for that space. So we establish a whole estero. We wanted us to have that connection, more connection to our bodies of water. So in a way, the place would be able to teach people to value our bodies of water. So by creating that estero all around the building, all around the property, we are able to create an experience, a different types of experiences, because the estero runs all around in some ways through an urban quarter here. Then you have on the left side a forested quarter, and then this quarter is with like we 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 propose to have flowering trees instead, an array of flowering trees here in the front side of the property. So having that estero, we can activate the holes all around the esteros and activate it and become the estero becomes our main street. Instead of having walkways, we have more of connection, and you can imagine we could have events here where we have fluvial parades, etc. So, and then increased connection of the people with the water. Instead of having barriers, we would like people, because this is only around 4 feet. We can have people here safely navigate this space. Another proposal of ours was to create a plaza, but not just a plaza, because part of the idea of some of the urban planning in our smaller towns, especially the Hispanic ones, the colonial towns, you had the plaza, but the plazas were built like they were in Europe, so they were unshaded. So sometimes people won't be able to use these places. So we wanted to have that, but create shade. So what we did was, instead we have the plaza down, and the shade above, we designed a series of ramps that go up into the building and create some sort of a mountain and create a grand lawn, which could at times become a viewing platform for theater events or performances that from down here, that would be filled with people. So the idea was to create a connection, not just a roof above the plaza, but the roof also doubles as a ramp going up into the grand lawn. And the lawn is not, it won't be just a flat lawn, but the lawn would be tiered or sloped so that it can function as a theater of some sorts there. So this is the public space entering from below. People are able to climb up from different spaces, and they are surrounded with flowering trees. And this is the museum. So this is the entrance to the museum. And then what we did was also at the same time, at the same way we did for some of the other buildings, we put them in stilts, and so that people are able to use the ground floor easily. The ground floor becomes an open park, and the museum ladders up. So you have a series of ramps undulating all around the exhibition spaces, connecting them while maintaining underneath the open park. So that was our proposal for the conceptual design of the Bagong Nayong Pilipino. The last one is Museo Kordilyera. So this was Museo Kordilyera. It was intended to be an extension of this building. This building is the Galleria Kordilyera, where you had they intended to have exhibits, but it was, instead of having exhibits, they used it as a canteen. So they wanted us to do a building either here on this side, on that side, or here in front. But we decided otherwise. we thought that instead of having the building on top here, replacing this public plaza, because we wanted really to maintain this public plaza, we have we would recreate this one to be the entrance, and then the museum would be underground. These were our first renderings of the building. So the building, we did this design very quickly. We had only around a month's time to do the whole design. So these were very quick renderings of the idea. So this was what we presented to the council. Here, the museum will be underground. So this was also one of the first renderings that we had of the museum. Again, one of the first renderings as well. So this is the entrance building. So the entrance building is at in a way, the third level of the existing theater here on this side. Then you go down through this area here to the permanent or to the main gallery, and then you have utility areas here, and then we intended to have an audiovisual room and storage room here. And then we designed a visible storage because because the space was relatively small. So instead of having walls to cover the storage, we had glass walls instead. So it becomes a visible storage. There. So these are some renderings of the building. So because at that time we were also designing the adjacent building, which will become the cultural hub, which I will discuss later. The timber that was demolished there, we put them and redesigned them to be the roof rafters and trusses of this entrance building. So the Museo Kordilyera was part of the whole idea of having at the center of the university a cultural hub. So part of that cultural hub was also to rehabilitate the existing Bulwagang Wanduna, which becomes the theater. And then underneath the theater is an art gallery, a bookshop, and we moved the Kordilyera Study Center from the other side of the campus to this part as well, so that we centralize all of the cultural thrusts of the university in just one quad. So this is the Bulwagang Wanduna. So the idea for the Bulwagang Wanduna is to have, because the UP campus, UP Baguio campus is very small, we identified, but we still wanted to have, or we wanted to maximize the space that was available to us. So we established a rooftop park on top of the building. But what we did was, instead of having just a flat roof, we sort of tapered it, shaping it like the mountainside across. So we shaped the roof of the building with the topography that we see all around it. And then we establish a step hardscape that connects down to the library here. So this is how it looks now. So it's under construction. So this is the step. These are the steps that go up to the roof of the building. So these are the rehabilitation works that we had to do. So what's interesting here is that because we inserted this whole structure, the roof of the building, between the beams and columns of existing buildings, we had to do very 9-meter piles all around the building, draw, and then build all around it, then bring all of them up, then establish trusses that that span around 18 meters to cover the whole building, so that we can establish a park on top. So this is level 1 at the basement. So the basement level connects to Museo Kordilyera directly. So this basement level can become an extension of the Museo Kordilyera. So in the gallery as well. These are the stairs that go up to the next gallery here, and then we have a distinct space here, an exhibition space that is double height. So we established that for special circumstances. This is the Kordilyera Study Center, where you have a bookshop as well that directly connects to the gallery. This becomes the art gallery, which may be an extension of the Museo Kordilyera as well. And instead of having a closed gallery, we wanted to have a gallery that's open to the deck here outside, which is covered, then which connects to the Museo Kordilyera on this side. So the curators would be able to hold art exhibits that can be fully open or optionally fully closed, whatever they deem would be necessary. So on the 3rd floor of the building is the theater itself. So this is the theater. So we expanded the theater. This was the old footprint of the theater, and we added a few meters to the sides, and we where we had piles down here to bring. So the structure above is separate from the existing building here. So we wanted to have still maintain that multipurposeness of the theater. So we had designed retractable seating, so that all of the theater seats would all compress to this area, so that it becomes just an open space. So you can have a proscenium style theater at the same time. You can have just an open multipurpose hall here, and we designed it with adequate acoustic insulation. So for the entrance building, for the rooftop, we designed it to have some planting, and becomes a landscape, places for lectures, outdoor lectures, etc., or events. This is the roof now. So for the entrance lobby, we decided not to cut the very large three large pine trees all over the site. So instead of having a regular box lobby, the lobby was sort of, in a way, a series of ramps, a series of stairs, sometimes very convoluted because of the shape of the building. So we did not intend it to be to be iconic in itself, but we intended it to be defined by the shape of its environment, not by anything else. This is the lobby. So you see several ramps that connect from the entrance here up. At the same time, you have a ramp and stair combination where this can become sort of in a way, seating and a waiting area. Then which we have a split level, one going up to the theater and the second going down to the galleries. And then another one, another entrance on the other side here. And then below it, underneath the entrance is, again, the building would be on stilts so that we can use the underside of the building to be used as a open public space, also a connection to the library, adjacent library. So the structure would be all in timber except for the floor, which will be in polished concrete. So I would like to conclude with just some commentary on the upcoming Freedom Memorial Museum, announced several weeks ago. So when we saw it, we, uh, I just wanted to say something about it. So I hope it does not upset some people. Considering this is an alternative view, I think our freedoms would allow us to do this. Yeah. So this is the new design for the museum to be located within the UP Diliman campus, which should be constructed soon. Located are adjacent the Fine Arts Building, and then you can see in this series of images how the buildings is uh, distance from the public or from the street from. So I think it's probably a deliberate attempt to detach it from the public, and created this expanse of landscape. Uh, doesn't look very human in scale. It seems very inhospitable. It's very difficult to access, and probably very disorienting. And because of the lack of shade, um, uh, inhospitable. You can see how architects prioritize the image of the building. So, which was, I think they shaped it in the shape of a kamao. So this is the trouble with creating something iconic. You would sometimes prioritize its iconicness instead of prioritizing the users of the building. So they've neglected a lot of the elements around the site, um, including the very large rain trees that surround the site. I don't see them on the plan. They must have completely removed them. And also, they had this large entrance podium, which is fine for very old buildings. We would have it. We would prefer to have it this more approach the people instead of the people approaching the building. So that the building becomes very formidable in this sense, especially with those with disabilities. So designed to be seemingly isolated, like an island, like a mall, where what's important is what's going on inside the building rather than what's going on the outside, which is like the outside is a no man's land. This is a big missed opportunity, especially of what the building memorializes. It's very ironic in that sense. So you may ask, how would we redesign this building? First, we would have to find what's already strong about the design. We find this diagonal thing is very strong. So focus on creating a memorial, not a landmark. So what we would do is prevail the statement of both the importance of remembering and keeping memory alive more than a structural whim or iconic, uh, designing it more iconic, but enhancing the experience undisguised by ornament. Create a building that is plain, evident, and unequivocal. Second, the building should demonstrate freedom's power and volatility. Express physically freedom's difficult climb to maintain a vigilant cycle to preserve our freedoms from those who seek to usurp it. Here we create the whole roof, as you see here, of the building to allow people to climb it, literally climb freedom's difficult climb. At the end, at the end of that climb, you have that sweeping view of the landscape. And finally, recreate a healing environment. Surround the building with a forest. Restore what may have disappeared as a result of development. Thus, moving on with an evident antithesis to what the building should stand for, without pretense, and surrender to nature our true freedoms. Thank you. Thank you. So
Okay.
that
Thank you
ends
so
my talk.
much. Yeah, thank you so much, Architect Go. That is a very long and very informative talk. So now we proceed directly to the Q&A. So there are some questions here. Uh, the first question is you mentioned about the concurrent functional aspect of museum design,
Yes.
and you mentioned about the possibility of expansion. So one of the concerns for HEIs and other museums is that often they have insufficient funds, to finance a full-scale museum immediately. So what do you think could be done for this particular aspect?
So firstly, there has to be a very thoughtful master plan that connects everything within all of the ideas, that even the entire urban fabric is already there, well planned before anything else. Even though we don't have money, we can plan. So, and that's very important. And then consider in the planning process also the plans of the whole city, or integrate it with the plans of the city. Or even if the city does not have a plan, you can propose to the city your plans. And then once you have the financial capability to build, uh, even though with little amounts, like what we did for Museo Kordilyera, the initial budget was only 10 million. So, but because we had a plan, we had a master plan around it, we wanted to establish quads all around the campus, or open spaces all around the campus. We had to maintain the open space above. So it also informs us on how we would do the design, and at the same time do the construction in phases. Now that we knew that we wanted to do a creative hub at the center of the campus, we did not do anything else with the existing theater. Um, and then because they were proposing some funding, there was some funding I think available to do the theater immediately, but we said that that amount of I think 5 million would not be enough to rehabilitate the whole theater or create some sort of structure. So that when UP had the money to construct, we did phase one for the museum with that 10 million, excavating it, doing some basic structures, and then waited for I think a year before we could get more funding for phase two, and again for phase three. So the same with all of the other projects, we phased them in several stages, to a point that now in some projects we are in phase four. But because we had a direction plan, it gave us that advantage uh, of knowing where to put our money.
Thank you, Architect. So the best way to do for startup museums is to plan this into
Yes,
phases, right? As soon as
yes,
they accumulate all the funding for setting up a complete museum. All
yes,
right. So in relation to the objects, to the museum design, of course, for startup museums, they cannot predict what collections or objects that will be donated to the museum
yeah,
or purchased in the future. And of course, you build a permanent collection. For instance, big objects not fitting in a small museum, or vice versa. So how do we address this issue, especially for HEI starting their own museums?
Yeah, it's very difficult to not know from the very beginning what you want or what you expect to have in the museum, but you can actually predict what, let's say for Museo Kordilyera, we predicted to have some sort of exhibit where you have sort of a ifugao or a, a iboloy hut within the building, which I think you did, right? You were
Yeah.
they were able to put a small house within the museum because we were sort of in a way envisioning that when we did that high ceiling space. So that's why part of my presentation was also to create several types of exhibition spaces already available to the users from the very beginning. So but in the case of the Museo Cordillera, because of space, and we were not able to do as many exhibition spaces as we wanted to. But we had at least two to three types already there, which can be used much flexibly. So design for flexibility is very important.
Okay, thank you, Architect. We have a lot of questions coming in. So, what about what are your thoughts that you can give for those museums that already have currently existing old heritage structures? Can this be converted as museum spaces? This is
Yes,
from Donel Rabusa.
yes. One is you could start off by identifying the the very salient architectural character of the building first, and then and what's important to people, what gives people memory to that place. Uh, if it's immemorable, so you could you can also demolish it. But of course, if it's really important to you, especially the community, the buildings are very important to them. As much as possible, you preserve the existing fabric of the building. One way is to create a separate one or just connect it to the existing one. And probably, let's say, you have a bahay na bato. The bahay na bato can become the entrance of the museum. And then the museum could be underground, or the museum could be behind it, or could be somewhere else.
Mhm.
So but this one is a design thing that varies greatly case to case. So uh, to answer it directly, it's not going to do it justice. So it has to be done on a case per case basis.
Okay, so a careful planning or a well thought out design could
Yes,
address this
yes,
particular
yes.
issue. So, in relation to that, there's a related question from Alex de los Santos. So, although the designs and what you mentioned are very impressive, but to be realistic with the HEI context, some have existing museums which are, used only for classrooms. No, what advice could you give on this?
Um, what's EGI? Sorry, EGI or
HEI, higher educational
higher? Sorry, HEI. Yeah, sorry. Uh,
universities.
yeah. That's the thing. So you start off with, let's say, annexing several classrooms, much like what they did in the St. Louis University. That can be the start. That can be the start of a building, because if you can display, let's say you can start off an exhibition within that very small space and gather interest within that space, and if it's curated really well, you can propose, and you can even get special funding from IKIN. No, no, no. You can even get special funding. Yeah. So and then you can start off with that, and then you can connect or even create a new building out of that. I think that's what happened with Ateneo, the Arete. They they started with they had a museum, but it was sort of in a way overflowing already with they had an art museum, and then I think they called for donations, but because they showed they already have this very strong curatorial culture that they established already with their first museum, it was very easy for them to propose to funding agencies or funding people to donate or to give them some sort of funding. Now they have a whole cultural hub and culture and science hub, which is great.
Okay. Again, there is a recurring question from the thread of questions from our participants. So you discussed earlier about retrofitting or renovating buildings into museums. Do you think it is a better practice to construct a new space rather than retrofitting old buildings? This is a question from Alisa Romiel Manalo.
Yeah, in the case of retrofitting or using old buildings, the good thing about old buildings is that they already have that character, which you don't have to rebuild. You do not need to create some sort of new thing, because you can just simply leverage what the old building has. The old building already has that character. It has that sort of, in a way, antique thing going on, in which you cannot do with a new building. Even if you replicate an old building and just simply copy it, it's simply not the same as having the real old thing there. So I would prefer to have retain as much as possible what's existing, as long as, of course, it has that connection with the community, or, or it has that value. But if its value is, it doesn't look good, it doesn't work well, yeah, the roof leaks and there are problems, the people don't like the building. uh, there are some reason there are times that you can decide to simply demolish the building, and it's part of change as
Mhm.
well. But
Right.
primarily, if it's take a look at its existing value, and if it's really valuable, especially to the community, just keep it.
Yeah. For a curator's point of view, some of these remnants are kept, especially from demolished buildings. No, so some of them keep the memorabilia.
Yes.
You can have a photo exhibition based on archival photographs, the plans, and
Yeah.
like a stone from that building. I've seen some museums done that when they totally demolish the old buildings to
Yeah.
give way to the new museums. Okay, from Maria Cecilia Medina, she has a question here. What are the advantages or disadvantages of having permanent displays or versus exhibits in our exhibition halls? Okay. So anyway, to rephrase it, what is the advantage of having permanent museums displays versus another exhibition ongoing in their exhibition halls, no? Because there is so many artifacts that they collected in the museum, and they have very few storage for this, so they have to put everything in exhibition halls. How
Yeah.
can you
uh,
advise about
yeah.
for instance,
If
order?
yeah, one is the risk there is have making it look like it as if it was like an antique shop. If you put all of your exhibit or all of your artifacts just in one place, and then that's one there is one risk of it. But probably I'm not the right person to answer this, because the curators would have probably a different idea on uh, about permanent exhibitions and their existence. Uh, well, permanent exhibitions sometimes are really not permanent in a certain sense, because you can mix and match them. You have that permanent collection probably, but that permanent collection gets mismatch matches depending on the need of the museum. Not exactly a permanent exhibition where you have it like the Baguio Museum. It has this continuous museum since I was since I was in grade school, they had that same exhibition, that same thing, on that same wall. Uh, yeah, so not that kind of permanent exhibition, but probably a permanent collection that's constantly revisited by different curators, so that you give a different light, a fresh take on. So the space has to be able to cater to that flexibility on the exhibition space. You can easily tear down walls. You can easily open things up. That's probably the architectural implications of that.
All right. So another question from Martin Genodepa. Okay, so he's asking about, please elaborate on the usual challenges encountered in the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings as museums, and how do you overcome them? Because you mentioned some examples in your presentation.
Yeah, sometimes the thing is overdoing it. Um, that would be, sometimes it destroys the historic character of the building itself. Uh, Sometimes overdoing the facade, adding certain things to the facade itself. Sometimes even, like, let's say, introducing landscape that's incompatible with the look of the building or the building itself. So um, so these are a lot of challenges. One is, some are legal, especially if you have listed building, historical heritage listed building. You have a lot of loops to go through, which is sometimes very difficult. Um, but sometimes you just have, and sometimes our we want, in a way, one challenge is, some curators or some building owners want perfection, and sometimes heritage buildings don't have that. They don't have very clean lines. They have very um, rough painted walls, which which is their beauty. So sometimes you just have to keep it, and sometimes we don't have to do anything. We just have to clean the floor, put exhibitions up. We do not need to do anything else. There are times that we just have to restrict ourselves um, with for us. It's very difficult because we want to design. That's one difficulty when you if you're a designer doing a heritage building, because you want to put, in a way, your mark into that building. But because at the same time, what's important with the heritage, sometimes we might miss what's important with the heritage, forcing ourselves into the building, forcing our own design or our own thing with the building. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's an anonymous question here, anonymous attendee, and he's asking, in any of your museum projects, have you worked with a curator or a team during the planning stage?
Yes, yes. The Museo Kordilyera, we've really worked with them, and they've shaped Museo Kordilyera very, very well, and I've really learned a lot from them. A lot of them are speakers in our uh, in some of the modules here. So yeah, definitely, it would be good really to work with uh, artists or the curators themselves, because they know they what they need. So it sometimes we architects become neglect to compromise, and sometimes compromise, they say it's really a bad word. We do not compromise our design, so you hear that sometimes, which should not be, because it's a collaborative effort. So to make a building, you have to be more open to other inputs, like from curators, etc.
All right. So another question. What are the signs that a museum is, in quotation, dying with regards to its collection, exhibition, and architectural design?
For us, it's, as I was saying, probably repeating a lot of times in my presentation, is connection to the public. Um, Nowadays, the museums have to be relevant. They have to connect to the public. You shouldn't have walls. I know sometimes these are security measures that we have, that we put in the museum so that we, uh, especially our connection with the street, which is very important. Um, let's say I've seen a lot of museums that have a very good collection, but because of very poor curation, they're dying.
Yeah.
So it's like our computers. We might have very good hardware or architecture, but if the software is bad, even though the architecture might be able to support it, uh, so this go hand in hand. Curation and of course the content of your museum is also important with the architecture. So
Okay.
if one piece, the museum dies or it would be dying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question from Florita Garcia. Since you mentioned about the connection of the museum design and architecture to the public, um, the question is, should you consider, you mentioned about users, visitors, museum staff, and all of this. And she's asking, Florita Garcia is asking, is it better to leave the decision to the architect, or is it an architect and the staff in the building of a museum, which you mentioned also earlier? What if there are compromises? How do you agree to settle the differences?
Yeah, as I was saying a while ago, sometimes it's individual pride, and um, yeah, that's sometimes we architects are overcome by the building. You know, it becomes our artwork. Sometimes we consider buildings as artworks. So when we consider buildings as an artwork rather than as design, it becomes immutable. You can change it. So, but architecture should change, and architecture should be open. The design of architecture, especially, should be open to ideas. Uh, that much. Sometimes it's for some people. This is a very difficult thing to do because uh, in the past we architects were taught that our buildings were art. But for me, in my opinion, buildings are not art. They are functional objects that are very dynamic. If the users want to change the building, they want to color it pink, it's their call. So it's really now it's really up to the architect to really uh, recontextualize um, compromise, because sometimes it's accompanied compromise is accompanied with that negative connotation. So compromise should be more. If you say compromise, you should think of it as more of collaboration rather than the how we connotate with the word compromise. Uh, so sometimes, so if you're having a difficult time with the architect, if you're the owner, you could simply get a new one because it's you really have to find that collaborative thing. If you cannot find it with your designer, I think it's going to be really difficult. And if the designer forces himself or forces whatever he thinks is right, it's that's very difficult. That's very difficult. just as working with other people uh, is important in other fields, especially here. Um, yeah,
All right. So, in your presentation, it is eminent that you mentioned about open spaces. So, there's a question from Joseph Kua. Uh, how do we convince LGUs that the open and flowing public spaces is much needed, no? Because some of the LGUs would like to, build a lot of buildings. No, concretes are manifestations of development. So how do you convince the LGUs to favor open spaces in museums and other buildings and in the cities, for
yeah.
instance?
Sometimes the problem is uh, how we convince the LGU. Perhaps in our experience, it's more not to be antagonistic. That's one. Sometimes we become too antagonistic to, let's say, we have that less empathy with. It's more about people relations than really getting things done. Getting things done is the easy part, but having people agree to you is you being very agreeable. So being very agreeable requires you, if you're proposing something especially let's say to the LGU, not to be antagonistic. Huwag mong sabihin na ah, kasi ganito ginagawa nyo, dapat ganito. No, you have to be very social and very amiable to them. Um, and that's how you get people to agree. So it's more psychological, social, not really about technical. So we did Malcolm Square. It took a lot of, in a way, maneuvering to get that open space. They wanted to have several buildings, some a traditional building there, but what we thought of was just make it just one big open public space. But it was easy to convince them because we had sort of that we established that um, in a way good relations with some of the people in the city, and we had an easy time proposing when it was time to propose, uh, because we didn't go to the city just to propose. We just went there to city just to have a chat, talk to them. It's more of a social engineering thing rather than a real engineering thing. Yeah.
All right. So more questions. So Randy Noblesa is interested about your discussion on cultural hub in Baguio or the cultural hub in UP Baguio. What was the primary considerations in planning, and how is it going to be implemented as part of being a UNESCO creative city?
Actually, it was designed and planned even before the UNESCO Creative City. It was even part of the proposal to the Creative City, our cultural hub in UP Baguio. Um, uh, so it's really a collaboration of the administration, because the chancellor was very supportive, and everyone in the UP campus was very supportive. So if all of the people in the campus are very supportive and sometimes very patient, because it took us like 5 years to get to Museo Kordilyera. During that time, people were already complaining because it was just one big hole in the ground and nothing was happening. They were calling the chancellor. Some were rallying, not really rallying, but in a way, rallying in Facebook. They were complaining about that space. Why is it not building? Is there some sort of thing happening in the background? Meron bang ano dyan? Ganon. So, um, yeah. So to get to that, again, it's more about the people. Again, it's not really about the technical thing. The technical things are are easy. The most difficult thing is to get through people. Our buildings get built by a collaboration of people. If hindi, we wouldn't be able to make Museo Kordilyera or even the cultural hub if not for all of the whole campus or the whole UP Baguio community agreeing to it and making it work.
Okay. With regards to Museo Cordillera and all the examples that you mentioned in your slides, this is about also incorporating indigenous designs, no, in museums. So there's another question here. Can you give us some tips on how to not interpret indigenous designs literally in making museum architectural designs? Can you talk about the design choices you did for Museo Cordillera that were inspired by the indigenous culture?
Yeah. Firstly, do not be caught up too much on being indigenous or being Baguio or being the place where you want that building to be. Being caught up with that sometimes becomes um, much like much like the Freedom Memorial Museum. They were so caught up in doing the building as a symbol. So yung kamao, they really wanted that to be very prominent to the building to the point that they've neglected a lot of the things that the idealism itself of the memorial museum they've neglected. So sometimes, so in using symbolism, sometimes not using it at all may be the best thing. And if you really want to do the symbolism, look for, let's say for the Museo Kordilyera, that instead of looking for symbols, the tattoos, the fabric patterns, try not to look at that. And instead of looking at that, look at the people behind that. Because I think we forget sometimes these are just very prosthetic. The symbolisms are just prosthetic. What's important is, let's say, what's important within the culture that you're sort of in a way designing for. For the Cordillera, the important thing with the culture here is a connection to the outside, connection to nature. And then you have buildings that are very connected to each other, very tightly knit. So you have that. And then you have things raised from the ground. So you just get those elements from the culture that are not readily apparent. Um, at least that in our opinion. So in the buildings that we design, we do not put them directly on the building themselves. Instead, let's say for example, for G1, we hired people from Bontoc, Ifugao, and the Kalinga to do some of the woodwork inside the building. So but the style does not really matter. So what matters is the people who made it are Cordillerans. That makes it Cordilleran architecture. It's not the Cordilleran patterns that you put on the wall, which can just be done by anybody else.
All right. We have 15 minutes before 12. So let's just take in more questions
Okay.
because our discussion is um, interesting. So there is a question about more technical aspects, like, for instance, the access. Now, talk about access. Can you talk about the PWD or more specifically for orthopedic disability or the accessibility of Museo Cordillera's design? No? Can you give some comments on that?
Yeah. So I think on the west side of the building, we've established an elevator, which not it's not yet been constructed. So that's where the freight elevator and the um, um, that is in phase 4 of the. It will be constructed within after this phase, after all of the all of the cultural hub is done, that will be the last one that we'll have to put in.
Yeah. So, Architect Go, so in building museums, this is always a work in progress, right? So it never stops.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
our experience in Museo Kordilyera, there are a lot of renovations. You have to refurbish. In times of weather conditions and climate change, there are still issues that needs to be addressed. Which brings me to the question about temperature also. So there's a question from Rona Repancol. She would like to ask if it's possible to incorporate passive cooling as a ventilation technique in this time of climate change, especially specifically in the Philippines. And in Manila, of course, there's a different temperature with Baguio. So how do you deal with this
Yeah.
technical aspect?
So this is very difficult, especially for some of the museums, uh, because it's not possible to have passive cooling or use uh, passive cooling to cool or to ventilate a museum, especially if you have artifacts there. Because with the existing Philippine climate temperature, even without climate change, we have 80% to 100% humidity all year round. You have 6 months of the year. Like, for example, Baguio, it rains 6 months of the year. And then you already have that as an existing thing. It's not possible. You'll need to dehumidify the building, or else you'll have molds, you'll have. So these are some aspects uh, that are not doable with passive cooling, unfortunately. But in some areas where you could do that, let's say the lobby, that is very possible. So in the case of Museo Kordilyera, we just left the lobby um, passively cooled. But the glass walls, we have anti-UV film, anti-ultraviolet film, so that if we put textiles there, uh, they're not affected by UV light.
Right. So our current exhibition at the Museo Cordillera is on textiles. So and we have a lot of glass surrounding the museum. So we have to install these UV filters to protect all of these textiles. And of course, inside we have problem with humidity issues, but that has been addressed using some equipments in place inside the museum. Okay, so there's another question about fluorescent lights. Question there. You mentioned that fluorescent light isn't ideal for the artifacts in the case of the Baguio Museum. What would be a better source of light, especially for storage rooms that doesn't have a lot of windows?
So it's depending on the distance. I think some of the some of the other curators will be able to answer that. You need, probably, it's too technical, probably 200 lumens only, and LED light with around 90 CRI, or that's color rendering index. That's 100 CRI is like daylight, and then if you have 90 CRI, um, that's almost close to daylight, but not that close. The color, this is the color rendering index. How how would the eye see or perceive under this specific light conditions? So the higher the CRI, the better. So using LED lights, which are specifically designed for very low UV use, and probably using around 4,000 Kelvin color temperature, 3,500 to 4,000 Kelvin. That's more incandescent light range, would be ideal for the museum.
Okay. So there's another questions about concern about. So you have concretes, you have open spaces, but do you have any suggestions or recommendations for an area full of trees that needs to be developed? No. So how do you address the, for instance, in an environment that you plan to build a museum with a lot of trees?
Yeah, if you take a look at, like, we've done some projects in that way. What we did was, instead of having your regular foundations to be regular footings, which require some excavation, instead of doing that, you do bore piling. You have piles driven into the ground if the ground conditions allow it. So that's one. And then use lightweight materials. So you separate yourself from the ground via stilts, and then you just allow water to go underneath the house or underneath the building. That was our proposal for Circa. We wanted it to be on stilts so that we can open up the ground floor and open to the forest or to the creek beside it. So it has very good advantages, because you won't need to sort of do some sort of waterproofing or underlayer waterproofing underneath the concrete, because you're already elevated from the ground, from the very wet ground. And then you just allow water to flow. And then if you have, let's say, ferns or indigenous plants, you just allow them to grow underneath the building. Yeah, so it has its advantages, especially if you plan to do it in forested areas, which is a very, very nice space to do a museum in the middle of a forest. And then the building shape not necessarily will follow whatever shape the spaces between the trees or the branches create. So yeah, very interesting.
Okay, Architect Ko, there's a question about is there a formula on the how big a museum should be in terms of the ratio of visitors coming into the museum? Is there a formula for this?
I don't think so. Uh, yeah, there are, of course, we have sort of, in a way, we use standards per square meter per person, something like that. Uh, and for air, you have cubic meters per minute. For ventilation, you have, for lighting, you have lux lumens per square meter, something like that. So there are certain standards that we sometimes follow. Sometimes, but sometimes we do things, let's say, in very specific way, which are very site specific. So in a way, there are formulas or there are standards, but when it comes to designing in a specific location, it's really the location that will define the building.
All right. So another question from Jimbo Fatala. Given limited space and building, given the limited space and building interconnecting structures in the design museum, does that compromise walkability and thus may cause also confusion or disorientation for museum visitors?
Yeah, so that's where, let's say, if you have a very convoluted building where you have, let's say, for example, you have a campus and then you have several galleries inserted between buildings inside the campus, and then you have another building on one side and another building above it. One, you can do what you can do there is you can create wayfinding devices where, let's say, you color code the floor. They follow let's say, a red line that runs through the whole all of the corridors, and then they are led. Even though some spaces there can become offices, some spaces there can become, as long as they follow this red line all throughout the building, they know that they're following that line. This is the line for the museum. So all of the galleries are, although can be separated all over the building or all over the campus, it can they can still follow it. They can still know where to go. Yeah. So
Okay.
wayfinding devices would be the solution.
So there are still many questions here. I took note of them, and okay, I will accommodate three more, probably three more questions. Okay, From Desiree Gastiadia. Because our participants for this webinars are in various stages of developing their museums, no? And she said that they have a 200 square meters museum space, ground and lower level. Uh, she's asking what are some of the things we should avoid in terms of setting up our exhibitions in a very, very limited space. Your insights.
Yeah, one is in terms of connection to the outside. Avoid parking in front of the building, because if you have a 200 square meter space, I would imagine the frontage of the 200 square meter space is not that big. And if you're in an urban area, that's the front of the building. Do not put your parking in front of the building. uh, you can create an open space in front of the building to attract people. You can even put a cafe in front of the building so that it activates the front of the building as you enter. um, and then for the exhibition spaces, you can do a lot with 200 square meters. um, uh, so it actually depends on what type you want to exhibit. You the thing with 200 square meters is to create your exhibition spaces vertically, instead of horizontally. So that creates an interesting thing. And then the interesting thing there, you can create a sort of an atrium that visually connects uh, the users to all of the galleries, and then the galleries can be spread out within that atrium so that you would be able to see it. Or uh, it it and or create create some sort of a stack configuration where you have, let's say, imagine a spiraling ramp that goes around the whole property, and then all of the galleries are along with this ramp, going along while it spirals around the whole site. That's a possibility. But this all depends on your lot configuration and what's behind it, what's in front, and on the sides.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on the location.
Right. So, two more questions. You presented the Museo Kordilyera as an underground museum. There's a question here. How did you consider natural calamities, such as earthquakes, in your design, especially the Museo Kordilyera, since it is underground?
Yeah, so since it's underground, actually it's less affected by earthquakes, contrary to what might think. Because it's less affected because you have if you have a taller building, there's more, in a way, what engineers call moment on top. Just like a lollipop, you have more moment when you swing it up and down. But if the lollipop becomes shorter and shorter, much more if it's underground movement, it will just go along with the movement. You would feel the earthquake, but it's safer underground rather than above ground because there's
Correct.
less movement.
Mm-mm. Okay. You mentioned also about the designs for the Dominican Hill Retreat House.
Yes.
There's a question from Jerome Dio. In using an old heritage building as a new museum, how often you be monitoring and assessing the integrity of the structure, especially for 100 plus years old structures like the Dominican Hill or other heritage buildings used as museums?
Yeah. In that case, we would get specialist consultants to do that work, because we are not, in a way, I am not qualified, or we are not qualified to do that type of work. That type of work will fall with specialist conservation consultants who have that experience and that expertise.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, here's it's rather a comment by from Boots Herrera, who's the chief curator of the Areta Museum. So she notes, Architect Ko, the route of the loop to Arete is not accurate as you presented. Also, the grounds you showed is a portion of the amphitheater. So it looks unused because the grass have not been trimmed down during the lockdown. So there's also a note that those are not students' works as you presented in your slides. They were commissioned by works by the CP13 Artist Awardees. So these are well noted corrections. All right. So can you take one more?
Yeah.
Okay. Since it's the rainy season in during this time, no, so we have weird weather conditions due to climate change. How were you able to weatherproof Museo Kordilyera? Was there instances where there were water seep through the walls of the museum since it was built underground? So this is related to the earlier question.
Yeah. So this is the difficulty with government projects in our country, because the bidding process does not sort of encourage better contractors to bid for our projects. So instead, we get contractors who are, they bid typically on not these types of projects. They're not experts sometimes with these kinds of projects or have no experience in them. So that's one difficulty that we have. I think it's very universal, especially here in the provinces. You have better contractors who can construct much better buildings in Manila or Cebu or the larger cities, or but not here in the provinces, in the smaller cities where we have to deal with uh, this kind of so sometimes so there was a time that we had lots of several we had leaks within the property, so we had to redo some of the waterproofing. We had to have it removed.
Right.
We had it removed recently because the waterproofing from the very beginning did not work, so we had to bid it out again, a separate bid to do the waterproofing, to redo the waterproofing. So,
Correct.
yeah, part of any building's life.
Okay. Thank you, Architect Aris Go. Would you like to have some last words before we wrap up this session?
I'd just like to say thank you for having me here, and I hope we can do better, or a lot of a lot of you who are doing a lot. We can help you also with all of the other speakers here. I think we'll be going to some of your museums. We'll be visiting you, and we'll see you then.
All right. Thank you so much, Aris Go. Thank you so much for our participants. Maraming salamat po for joining us for today's session on museum architecture and design. Well, yesterday we had a very strong rains, no? And today the weather calmed down. I hope you are safe in your wherever you are from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And we look forward to your participation in the next session. Next week on October 28 and 29, the lectures, the webinars will be on museum collections and management by Peter Natividad, and also conservation of museum artifacts from Rod Enano. Both are from the Lopez Museum and Library. I hope you can join us and have a good day and be safe, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Architect Go.